In the heart of the lush, green lands of ancient Sri Lanka during a time when kingdoms were rising and falling, a young woman named Anula was born into a world filled with intrigue, power struggles, and the winds of change. Her early years were spent in the royal court of the Anuradhapura kingdom, a place where alliances were forged through marriage, and every move was carefully calculated. It was here, amidst the shadow of powerful figures and long-standing traditions, that Anula's journey began, a journey that would not only shape her destiny but also the course of Sri Lanka's history. Anula's family, though not the direct rulers of the kingdom, held a position of significant influence within the court. Her father, a noble of considerable wealth and standing, was known for his sharp political mind and his ability to navigate the complex relationships that governed the kingdom's upper echelons. From a young age, Anula was taught the arts of diplomacy, negotiation, and the delicate balancing act of power. She learned quickly that, in the world she inhabited, one's survival depended not only on strength and intelligence but on the ability to align oneself with the right people at the right time. But Anula was not content with merely being a pawn in the political games of the court. Even as a child, she exhibited an ambition that set her apart from others. She was not merely the daughter of a noble. She was destined for something more. As she grew older, Anula became known not only for her beauty but for her keen mind, her sharp wit, and her ability to persuade even the most hardened political figures. She was not just a figurehead in the royal court. She was a force to be reckoned with, and her influence extended far beyond her years. It was during this period that she first crossed paths with King Devanampiya Tissa, a ruler whose reign would come to define an era in Sri Lanka's history. Tissa was a young and ambitious king, eager to strengthen his rule and expand his kingdom's influence. He had inherited a kingdom rich in resources but rife with internal dissent and external threats. While Tissa was a capable leader, he was not yet the unchallenged monarch he would later become. He needed allies, and he needed them quickly. Anula, with her charm, intelligence, and connections, was the perfect ally. It was no surprise that Tissa, recognizing the potential of an alliance with such a formidable woman, sought her hand in marriage. The marriage, however, was not just a union of hearts, it was a union of power. It was a strategic alliance that would serve both parties well, but it would also be one that would forever alter the course of history. The marriage between Devanampiya Tissa and Anula was marked by the coming together of two influential figures. One a king seeking to solidify his rule, and the other a woman of great ambition and intellect. The wedding ceremony itself was a grand affair, one that would be remembered for generations. It was a celebration not only of love but of the new political landscape that was being forged in Sri Lanka. In the early days of their marriage, Anula's influence on Tissa was subtle but undeniable. She knew that to gain real power, she would have to move carefully, aligning herself with the right factions within the court while keeping her true ambitions hidden from those who might see her as a threat. It was a delicate dance, one that she performed with grace and precision. At first, Tissa, though impressed by his wife's intelligence, still relied heavily on the advice of his closest advisors. He was still trying to establish himself as a strong and capable leader, and the political landscape of Sri Lanka was fraught with challenges. But Anula, ever the strategist, saw an opportunity. She recognized that in order to truly secure Tissa's position, they would need the support of the people, not just the nobility but the common folk who made up the backbone of the kingdom. Anula's first major move came when she encouraged Tissa to build strong relationships with the Buddhist monks who were gaining influence across the island. At the time, Buddhism was spreading throughout Sri Lanka thanks in part to the efforts of King Ashoka of India, and it had begun to take root in the royal courts as well. Anula, recognizing the potential of Buddhism to both unite the people and solidify Tissa's reign, urged him to embrace the new faith. This would not only endear Tissa to the growing Buddhist population but would also allow him to present himself as a benevolent ruler, a king who ruled not by force, but with the wisdom of the Buddha. The decision was a pivotal one. Devanampiya Tissa, with Anula's encouragement, began to support Buddhism in earnest. He built temples, provided land for the Buddhist community, and invited monks to live and teach within the royal court. This marked the beginning of a new era in Sri Lankan history, an era where Buddhism would become the cornerstone of the nation's culture and politics. And Anula, though never one to seek the spotlight, had played a crucial role in guiding her husband toward this path. But as Tissa's influence grew, so did the challenges they faced. Rival factions within the court began to take notice of Anula's growing power, and some feared that she might become too influential, too dangerous. Anula was not a woman to back down in the face of adversity, however. She knew that in the world of ancient Sri Lanka, power was not given, it was taken. And she was more than willing to take what was hers. As the years passed, Anula's influence over Tissa only deepened. She was not just a queen by title, she was the true power behind the throne. Her advice was sought on matters of war, peace, and religion. She guided Tissa through political crises and ensured that the kingdom remained stable and prosperous. She helped him forge alliances with neighboring kingdoms and played a key role in defending the kingdom from external threats. But not all was smooth sailing. The political landscape of Sri Lanka was ever-changing, and as Tissa's power grew, so too did the resentment of those who had once been his allies. Rival factions began to rise against him. And soon the kingdom was facing threats both within and beyond its borders. Anula, however, was unshaken. She knew that in order to secure their future, they would have to fight, and they would have to fight with everything they had. As the years passed, Anula's influence over King Devanampiya Tissa grew ever stronger. Much like the roots of a great tree that gradually spread through the soil, silently fortifying the structure of the kingdom. Her position within the court had evolved beyond that of a mere consort. She was now the key political advisor, a formidable force in both the royal palace and in the vast, sprawling territories that Devanampiya Tissa ruled over. But as Tissa's power continued to rise, so did the threats to his reign, both from within his own kingdom and from external forces. Rival factions, some with ties to powerful noble families and others to military commanders, began to emerge from the shadows, seeking to challenge the growing dominance of the monarchy. As much as Tissa had been successful in establishing control over his kingdom, he was still a young king, vulnerable to manipulation and betrayal. It was in these moments of danger that Anula's political genius truly began to shine. Recognizing that the key to their survival lay in the strength of their alliances, Anula made a bold decision. She sought to strengthen the monarchy by cementing strategic marriages with powerful families and neighboring kingdoms. These alliances would not only secure Tissa's throne but also provide military support in the event of an external attack. She understood the delicate nature of such alliances, knowing full well that marriage in her time was not merely about love but about securing one's place in the larger game of thrones. Her first major alliance was with the powerful clan of the Naga, who controlled vast territories to the north. The Naga people, known for their warrior traditions and fierce loyalty, were a natural choice. Anula personally brokered the marriage between Tissa and a Naga princess, a move that solidified the kingdom's northern borders. This union proved to be a turning point in the history of the Anuradhapura kingdom. With the Naga as allies, the kingdom had a powerful military force at its back, ready to defend against any would-be invaders. But alliances alone were not enough to secure Tissa's reign. Anula knew that the hearts and minds of the people needed to be won over, and she was quick to recognize the potential of Buddhism as a unifying force. As Tissa grew closer to the Buddhist monastic community, Anula took it upon herself to ensure that Buddhism was deeply embedded in the cultural fabric of Sri Lanka. She sponsored the construction of temples and the establishment of monasteries throughout the kingdom, some in areas where the influence of Buddhism had not yet fully taken hold. Anula's patronage of Buddhism was not just an act of religious devotion, it was a masterstroke of political strategy. By aligning herself with the Buddhist monks, she garnered the support of the masses who saw in Buddhism a path to moral and spiritual clarity. Buddhism's message of peace, compassion, and enlightenment resonated deeply with the people. And in supporting it, Anula and Tissa secured the loyalty of both the common folk and the elite of Sri Lankan society. Yet, as Anula's power grew, so did the challenges she faced. The more she consolidated her position, the more she attracted the envy and suspicion of her rivals. Many of the noble families, who had once supported her rise to power, now saw her as a threat. They resented the fact that a woman, especially one who had not come from a long line of rulers, held such sway over the king. Some of these nobles began to whisper in the shadows, plotting against Anula and seeking to diminish her influence. Anula, however, was no stranger to the dangerous politics of the royal court. She had been trained from a young age in the art of negotiation and manipulation. She knew that in order to survive, she would need to strike at her enemies before they had a chance to strike at her. It was during this time that she made her most cunning move yet. A rival faction led by a powerful nobleman who had once been an ally of Tissa sought to challenge the king's rule. This nobleman, a man named Rajasingha, was not only wealthy but also had the support of a significant portion of the military. His ambitions were clear: he wanted the throne for himself. When Rajasingha attempted to rally his supporters in an effort to usurp Tissa's power, Anula saw an opportunity to eliminate him as a threat once and for all. In a daring move, Anula invited Rajasingha to the palace, under the guise of negotiating a peace settlement between their factions. It was a trap, carefully set and perfectly executed. Anula, using her charm and political acumen, persuaded Rajasingha to accept a new alliance between their families. However, once Rajasingha was within the palace walls, Anula ensured that he would never leave alive. He was imprisoned and, shortly after, executed on charges of treason, thus eliminating one of the most dangerous threats to Tissa's reign. The execution of Rajasingha sent a powerful message to the kingdom. Devanampiya Tissa's rule was unassailable and Anula was the true power behind the throne. The nobles who had once whispered against her now knew better than to challenge her authority. For a time, the kingdom was at peace, and Tissa's reign flourished under Anula's careful guidance. But peace, as always, was fleeting. As the years passed, new threats arose, and Anula found herself facing the same challenges she had encountered in the early years of her marriage to Tissa. However, this time she was no longer just a political advisor or a queen. She was a seasoned strategist, a woman who had fought and won many battles in the court of Anuradhapura. Her power was absolute, and with it she continued to guide her husband through the stormy seas of Sri Lankan politics. Throughout all of this, Anula never lost sight of her ultimate goal: securing the future of the kingdom. She knew that in order to ensure the long-term survival of the monarchy, Tissa's reign had to be remembered as one of peace, prosperity, and strength. It was through her support of Buddhism, her political maneuvering, and her unwavering determination that she was able to help Tissa achieve this vision, despite the many challenges they faced. As the kingdom grew stronger, so did the legend of Anula. She was no longer just the wife of a king, she was a queen in her own right, a powerful figure in the history of Sri Lanka. Her legacy, though not as widely known as her husband's, would live on in the hearts and minds of the people she had helped shape. The story of Anula was one of resilience, ambition, and the quiet strength of a woman who understood that power could be wielded not only with the sword but with the mind. As Devanampiya Tissa's reign continued to stabilize and strengthen, Anula's influence over the kingdom's politics was undeniable. She had become a figurehead not just of power but of strategy, guiding her husband through the intricacies of court politics, military campaigns, and religious reforms. However, this success did not come without its fair share of challenges. The more Anula consolidated her power, the more she became a target for those who coveted the throne or sought to undermine her authority. The royal court was a constant battleground of shifting alliances, rivalries, and power plays. In the midst of this turbulence, Anula's political acumen proved to be an invaluable asset to King Tissa. Yet, the external threats facing the kingdom were growing ever more pressing. The southern territories of Sri Lanka, rich in resources and strategically vital, were under constant threat of invasion by neighboring kingdoms. The rising power of the Tamil kings to the south was a significant concern for Tissa and his advisors, and the need for a strong military alliance was becoming more urgent. It was during this period that Anula began to focus her attention on forging alliances beyond the kingdom's borders. Understanding the importance of unity and strength in the face of external threats, she played a critical role in establishing diplomatic ties with several neighboring states. Her most significant achievement in this regard was a marriage alliance between Tissa and a princess from the Tamil kingdom. This move, though controversial, was a brilliant political maneuver. It not only secured a vital military alliance, but also ensured that the kingdom of Anuradhapura would have a strong presence in the southern regions. But the decision was not without its risks. Anula, ever perceptive to the potential threats to her influence, understood that the new alliance could be seen as a challenge to her own position within the court. The nobles and military commanders who had once supported her rise to power now began to question her motives. Whispers circulated within the royal court about Anula's growing influence, with some suggesting that she was becoming too powerful, that her ambitions were beginning to exceed the bounds of her role as queen. Anula, however, was no stranger to such rumors. She had faced opposition from within the court since her early days as queen, and she knew that in order to secure her legacy, she would need to address these concerns head-on. It was in these moments of political tension that she displayed her true brilliance as a strategist. Rather than retreating into the shadows or ceding power, Anula took the offensive. She carefully maneuvered within the court, aligning herself with key military leaders and influential nobles, ensuring that her influence was solidified not only in the royal palace but across the kingdom. But political alliances were not the only challenges Anula faced. Her role in supporting Buddhism, while strengthening her position among the common people, also attracted the attention of powerful religious factions. The growing influence of the Buddhist monastic community threatened the traditional power structures within the court, and some of the older nobles saw the rise of Buddhism as a direct challenge to their authority. These tensions came to a head when a faction of these nobles, led by a powerful and outspoken elder statesman, openly challenged Anula's support of Buddhism and its role in the governance of the kingdom. The dispute over Buddhism became one of the most significant political crises of Anula's reign. The confrontation between Anula and the anti-Buddhist faction reached its peak when the Royal Council, a body composed of the kingdom's most powerful nobles, was convened to decide whether the king would continue to support the Buddhist monks or distance himself from the faith. This moment of crisis presented a clear choice. Anula could either stand firm and risk alienating the powerful nobility, or she could bow to their demands and risk undermining her own influence and the religious reforms she had worked so hard to implement. With Tissa's support, Anula chose to stand firm. She argued that Buddhism, with its message of peace and unity, was essential to the long-term stability of the kingdom. She reminded the council that the king's rule was strengthened not only by military might but by the moral and spiritual guidance that Buddhism provided. In a bold and strategic move, Anula took the council by surprise, offering to have the royal court sponsor the construction of new monasteries in regions that had previously resisted the spread of Buddhism. This move not only secured the loyalty of the Buddhist monastic community but also displayed Anula's mastery of political negotiation and her ability to turn adversity into an opportunity. The council, unable to challenge the popular support that Anula commanded, reluctantly agreed to her proposal. The decision marked a significant victory for the queen, but it also highlighted the extent of the challenges she faced in maintaining control over the kingdom's political landscape. Her influence, though unparalleled, was constantly tested by rival factions and external threats. As Devanampiya Tissa's reign continued to thrive under Anula's guidance, the kingdom of Anuradhapura emerged as a formidable power in the region. Yet, despite the apparent stability, Anula knew that the true test of her legacy was still to come. The political landscape was shifting, and as the years passed, new threats would arise both from within the kingdom and from external forces seeking to challenge her authority. Anula's greatest challenge would be ensuring that her legacy and the future of Sri Lanka remained secure for generations to come. As Anula's influence continued to grow, the political landscape of Sri Lanka was shifting in ways that would have lasting effects. The alliance she had carefully forged between the Anuradhapura kingdom and the neighboring Tamil kingdoms was beginning to show signs of strain. The southern borders of Sri Lanka, once secure, were now vulnerable to growing pressure from the increasingly powerful Tamil forces. While Devanampiya Tissa had secured peace for much of his reign, the situation in the south was becoming more precarious by the day. The Tamil kings, who had long eyed Sri Lanka's southern territories, saw the growing power of Anuradhapura as both an opportunity and a threat. In this delicate moment, Anula's political acumen was more crucial than ever. She understood that the future of the kingdom depended not just on military strength but on the ability to navigate the complex web of alliances, betrayals, and shifting loyalties that characterized the region's political climate. If Tissa's rule was to survive the growing external pressures, Anula knew that she would have to step into the arena once again. This time, not just as a queen, but as a stateswoman of unparalleled skill. Anula's first move in this new political chess game was to seek out an alliance with the southern kingdoms, notably the Tamil rulers who had long been a thorn in Sri Lanka's side. She knew that in order to secure peace and maintain her husband's rule, she would need to play a long game of diplomacy, building trust with the Tamil kings while simultaneously ensuring that the Anuradhapura kingdom's power was not undermined. Her approach was methodical and patient, Rather than rushing into negotiations, Anula sent envoys to the southern kingdoms, carrying gifts and promises of mutual cooperation. The Tamil kings, wary of Sri Lanka's growing power but intrigued by the possibility of peace, agreed to meet with her representatives. It was during these negotiations that Anula's diplomatic prowess truly shone. She listened carefully to the grievances of the Tamil rulers, understood their concerns, and presented a vision of a shared future, one where both kingdoms could thrive without the constant threat of war. In the royal court of Anuradhapura, many of the nobles were skeptical of Anula's approach. The idea of negotiating with the Tamil kings was seen as a sign of weakness by some, and whispers began to circulate that Anula was more interested in preserving peace than in securing the kingdom's dominance. However, Anula's steadfast belief in the power of diplomacy allowed her to push through these concerns. She had no intention of compromising the kingdom's strength, rather, she saw diplomacy as a way to solidify it. She knew that an alliance with the Tamil kingdoms would not only protect the southern borders but also provide economic opportunities that would benefit both regions. Meanwhile, Tissa, though supportive of his wife's efforts, remained largely hands-off in the negotiations. His focus was on strengthening his kingdom's defenses and maintaining peace within the court, which had been increasingly destabilized by the ambitions of rival factions. Despite the relative stability in the kingdom, there were still those who sought to exploit any perceived weakness, and they were eager to see Anula's diplomatic efforts fail. Tensions within the court were high, and the nobles, many of whom were deeply distrustful of Anula's growing influence, began to murmur among themselves. Yet Anula's focus remained unwavering. She worked tirelessly, consulting with military commanders, local leaders, and religious figures, ensuring that the peace negotiations were supported by every corner of the kingdom. Her diplomatic strategy was not just about securing an alliance with the Tamil kings. It was about ensuring that her husband's reign would be remembered not for the wars he fought, but for the peace he achieved. The peace treaty she brokered with the southern kingdoms was groundbreaking, and when it was finally signed, it sent shockwaves through the region. For the first time in centuries, the southern borders of Sri Lanka were secure. The Tamil kings, recognizing the wisdom and strength of Anula's leadership, agreed to a ceasefire, pledging to respect Sri Lanka's territorial integrity in exchange for promises of trade and mutual protection. The treaty was hailed as a diplomatic triumph, and Anula's status within the court and among the people reached new heights. She had not only secured peace for the kingdom, but she had also elevated her own position as a leader in her own right. No longer was she simply the wife of Devanampiya Tissa, she was now a political force in her own right, one whose influence extended far beyond the royal palace. But peace, as always, was fragile. The treaty with the Tamil kings did not end the political intrigue within the court, and Anula soon found herself facing a new set of challenges. Her growing power had not gone unnoticed by the royal nobles, and many of them began to view her as a threat to their own positions. The whispers that had once been confined to the shadows of the palace now began to grow louder as factions within the court sought to undermine her influence. The nobles, particularly those who had supported the old guard, saw Anula's rise as a direct challenge to their own authority. They had long controlled the affairs of the kingdom, and the idea that a woman, especially one who had once been an outsider, could wield such power was intolerable to them. They began to plot against her, seeking ways to discredit her and diminish her influence in the eyes of Tissa and the people. Anula, however, was no stranger to political maneuvering. She had seen the rise and fall of many court factions during her time as queen, and she knew that the key to her survival lay in maintaining control of the narrative. She began to gather her own supporters, quietly consolidating power among the military leaders, the Buddhist monks, and the common folk. She made sure that Tissa, though still the king, relied more and more on her judgment in matters of state. It was during this time of internal unrest that Anula faced her greatest political challenge. A faction within the royal court, led by a powerful nobleman who had once been a close advisor to Tissa, made a bold move to challenge her authority. The nobleman, a man named Visala, sought to undermine Anula's influence by questioning her loyalty to the throne. He accused her of using her diplomatic efforts to advance her own ambitions rather than the kingdom's well-being. His accusations were not only dangerous, they were effective, and they quickly gained traction among the more conservative factions of the court. Visala's challenge came at a critical moment. The kingdom was still recovering from the peace treaty with the Tamil kings, and tensions were high both within the court and along the borders. Anula knew that she could not afford to let Visala's accusations go unchallenged. If she did, her entire political strategy would collapse and her legacy would be irreparably damaged. In a dramatic turn of events, Anula summoned Visala to the royal palace. The confrontation that followed would forever change the political landscape of Sri Lanka. With Tissa by her side, Anula confronted Visala, publicly exposing his attempts to manipulate the court for his own gain. She deftly turned the accusations against him, revealing that it was Visala, not she, who had been plotting to usurp the throne. The royal court, stunned by the turn of events, rallied behind Anula. Visala was imprisoned, and his supporters were purged from the palace. Anula had not only silenced her political rivals but had also strengthened her position within the court. The nobles, recognizing her strength, grudgingly accepted her dominance. For the moment, at least, Anula had secured her place as the true power behind the throne. But as she looked at the now quiet royal court, Anula knew that her victory had come at a cost. The kingdom was safe for now, but the challenges she had faced were only the beginning. She had to remain vigilant. The balance of power in Sri Lanka was delicate, and with every move she made, Anula was acutely aware of the ever-present threats that could bring it all crashing down. The defeat of Visala and the stabilization of Anula's power within the royal court marked a brief respite for the Anuradhapura kingdom. However, despite her political triumph, Anula knew that her position remained precarious. The balance of power was fragile, and every victory seemed to be met with a new set of challenges. In this volatile environment, Anula's mind was ever focused on securing a lasting legacy for herself, her husband, and the kingdom. She knew that in order for Tissa's rule to endure and for Sri Lanka to thrive, the political landscape had to remain stable, and the people, both nobles and common folk, had to be united under a common cause. Anula's understanding of the kingdom's inner workings gave her a unique advantage. She recognized that while external threats were significant, internal discord, particularly among the aristocracy, could be even more damaging in the long run. With that in mind, she began to shift her focus from the battlefield to the palace, where power struggles among the nobles were simmering beneath the surface. Although she had already gained significant influence over her husband, Anula understood that securing the loyalty of the noble families was just as important. Without their support, her reign, and that of Tissa, would be nothing more than a house of cards ready to fall. To achieve this, Anula set about crafting a network of allies within the court. She made it her mission to identify those who were loyal to Tissa and those who sought to use his reign for their own gain. In her role as queen, she began to quietly guide the direction of the court, subtly influencing the decisions of the nobles while ensuring that Tissa remained the figurehead of authority. Anula's genius lay in her ability to make those around her believe that the power they were gaining was in line with Tissa's wishes, even when it was, in fact, Anula who was pulling the strings. Her first move in this regard was to solidify her relationship with the military commanders who were crucial to maintaining the kingdom's security. Anula understood that the loyalty of the military was vital, especially as the kingdom's southern borders remained vulnerable to attacks from the Tamil kings. She began by hosting private meetings with the top generals, assuring them that her primary concern was the security and prosperity of Sri Lanka. These meetings were informal, designed not to intimidate but to make the generals feel as though they were in a position of power. She acknowledged their contributions to the kingdom's strength and made them feel integral to the kingdom's success. In exchange for their loyalty, Anula made subtle promises: land grants, the power to make decisions on military matters, and even positions of influence in the royal court. By positioning herself as a protector of their interests, Anula was able to gain their trust, ensuring that the military would remain firmly in her corner. This alliance with the military would prove vital in the coming years as threats from outside the kingdom escalated and internal rivalries continued to brew. But her efforts didn't stop there. Anula understood that she could not only rely on military power to maintain stability. To truly consolidate her influence, she needed the support of the religious community, particularly the Buddhist monks who were increasingly becoming the moral and spiritual compass of Sri Lanka. Buddhism, which had been embraced by Tissa with Anula's encouragement, had become a unifying force in the kingdom. The monastic community wielded immense influence, and the monks had the ear of the people. Anula recognized that by aligning herself with the Buddhist clergy, she could secure the loyalty of the masses, ensuring that the king's reign remained unchallenged. Over the years, Anula had developed close relationships with the senior monks who oversaw the kingdom's largest monasteries. She continued to fund the construction of Buddhist temples and supported the monks' efforts to spread the teachings of the Buddha throughout the kingdom. This patronage not only solidified Anula's standing with the religious community but also created a powerful alliance between the crown and the clergy. By positioning herself as a benefactor of Buddhism, Anula effectively tied her political legitimacy to the faith, making it difficult for her rivals to oppose her without risking public backlash. Despite her growing network of allies, Anula was not blind to the threats that remained. She knew that while the kingdom was at relative peace, it would only take one wrong move, one moment of weakness, for the delicate balance of power to collapse. The Tamils, though temporarily appeased by her diplomatic efforts, were still a looming threat, and the kingdom's southern borders remained vulnerable. Anula's attention, therefore, was divided between ensuring the stability of the court and preparing for the possibility of renewed conflict with the Tamil kings. The quiet tension along the southern frontier was felt across the kingdom, and whispers of a potential invasion began to circulate. The Tamil rulers, having long desired control over the southern territories, were rumored to be amassing an army. Anula, ever perceptive to the currents of power, knew that the time for action was fast approaching. She turned to her newly forged alliances with the military and the Buddhist clergy, seeking their counsel and support in the event of a conflict. It was during this time of preparation that Anula's political acumen would be tested in ways she had not anticipated. A messenger arrived at the royal court one morning, bringing news that the Tamil forces had begun to move and their armies were marching toward the southern borders of Sri Lanka. The kingdom, which had enjoyed a period of relative peace, was once again on the brink of war. Tissa, though resolute in his determination to protect his kingdom, knew that he could not fight alone. He turned to Anula for guidance. She wasted no time, immediately setting into motion a plan that would not only defend the kingdom but also secure her position within the royal court. Anula's strategy was bold. She would lead the military forces herself, alongside Tissa, in a show of strength and unity that would both protect the kingdom and demonstrate her own leadership abilities. Anula's decision to personally accompany Tissa to the front lines of the southern borders was a calculated one. It sent a message to the nobles and military commanders alike. She was not just a queen of the palace. She was a queen of the people, a leader who would fight alongside her husband to protect the kingdom. This move was not without its risks, but Anula knew that the stakes were too high to allow fear or doubt to cloud her judgment. As the two leaders made their way south to confront the Tamil army, the royal court was left in a state of uncertainty. The nobles, who had grown accustomed to Anula's political maneuvering, were unsure of what to make of her sudden departure from the palace. Would she return triumphant, securing her position as the true power behind the throne? Or would she fail, and with it, her reign? As Anula and Devanampiya Tissa led their forces southward to confront the growing threat from the Tamil kingdoms, the royal court of Anuradhapura buzzed with uncertainty. The nobles, who had long been accustomed to the political games and maneuverings of the royal family, were now faced with an unprecedented situation. For the first time, the queen, who had been the quiet force behind the throne, was stepping into the spotlight as a leader in her own right. The journey south was long and fraught with peril. The kingdom's southern borders were rugged, the terrain unforgiving, and the Tamil forces, though not as large in number, were known for their strategic brilliance and fierce determination. Anula knew that this would be a test not only of her leadership but of the kingdom's resolve. The stakes were high. If they failed, it would mean the loss of not just territory, but also the fragile peace that had been established through years of political maneuvering. As the royal procession neared the southern borders, Anula found herself growing more determined with each passing day. The gravity of the situation was not lost on her, and as she rode beside Tissa, she reflected on the years of hard work that had brought them to this point. Her alliances, her political maneuvering, her careful cultivation of power, everything had led to this moment. She could not afford to let it slip away. Upon reaching the front lines, Anula took a decisive step. in a move that would solidify her status as a military leader. She joined the commanders on the battlefield, offering her expertise in both strategy and diplomacy. Tissa, though still the king, had come to trust her judgment implicitly. Together, they devised a plan to not only repel the Tamil forces but to secure the kingdom's borders for generations to come. Anula's knowledge of the terrain, her strategic mind, and her ability to rally the soldiers made her an invaluable asset to the military campaign. The first skirmish with the Tamil forces was brutal. The battle took place on the banks of a river that marked the border between the two kingdoms. Anula and Tissa, standing side by side, watched as the two armies clashed in a violent and chaotic melee. The Anuradhapura forces, though well-trained, were initially overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of the Tamil soldiers. But Anula, ever the strategist, had anticipated this. She had stationed reinforcements along the riverbanks, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the Tamil forces pressed forward, confident in their initial success, Anula gave the order to unleash the reinforcements. The Anuradhapura soldiers, newly invigorated and strategically positioned, pushed the Tamil army back, forcing them into a retreat. The battle was hard-fought, but in the end, the kingdom's forces emerged victorious. Anula had proven herself not just as a queen but as a leader in the truest sense, one who was capable of commanding respect both on the battlefield and in the court. The victory at the river marked a turning point in the campaign. The Tamil forces, stunned by their defeat, regrouped, but they were no longer able to advance into the heart of the kingdom. Anula, seizing the opportunity, took command of the next phase of the campaign. She ordered a series of strategic raids along the Tamil kingdom's borders, cutting off their supply lines and forcing them into a defensive position. The kingdom's forces were now in control of the battlefield, and the momentum had shifted in their favor. But the victory came at a cost. The battle had taken a heavy toll on the kingdom's soldiers, and morale was beginning to wane. Anula, understanding the psychological impact of war on her troops, made sure to visit the wounded and speak to the soldiers on the front lines. Her presence, as always, had a calming effect on those around her. She reminded them of what was at stake: the survival of their kingdom, the preservation of their way of life, and the future of their families. She spoke of unity, of strength in adversity, and of the honor that came with defending their land. Her words inspired the troops, and soon they were ready for the next phase of the campaign. As Anula's influence continued to grow, so too did the challenges she faced from within the court. The nobles who had once feared her growing power now saw an opportunity to undermine her authority. They whispered behind her back, questioning her motives and accusing her of overstepping her bounds. The factionalism that had long existed in the royal court flared up once again, and Anula knew that her success on the battlefield would not be enough to secure her place in the kingdom's future. It was at this moment that Anula decided to take a more direct approach to solidify her power within the court. She called upon her most loyal supporters, military commanders, trusted advisors, and influential nobles who had backed her rise to power, and began to consolidate her position. She made sure that her allies were given key positions within the court and the military, ensuring that they would have a vested interest in maintaining her influence. Anula also began to pay closer attention to the religious leaders of the kingdom. Buddhism had become deeply ingrained in Sri Lankan society, and the monks wielded considerable power. While she had already garnered their support through her patronage of the religion, Anula recognized that the monks' influence could be both a blessing and a curse. If they turned against her, it could spell disaster for her rule. To counter this potential threat, she strengthened her ties with the Buddhist clergy, ensuring that they would remain loyal to her and Tissa. In exchange for their continued support, Anula promised to continue funding the construction of monasteries and temples, further cementing Buddhism's place in the kingdom's future. Despite the internal tensions and external threats, Anula's leadership remained strong. Her position within the court and the kingdom had never been more secure. Her military victories had proved her worth, and her political maneuvering had ensured that she would remain a central figure in Sri Lanka's future. But Anula knew that the challenges were far from over. The Tamil forces, though defeated in battle, were not finished, and there were still those within the court who would stop at nothing to bring her down. As Anula prepared for the final stage of the campaign, she found herself once again at a crossroads. The path ahead was uncertain, and the future of Sri Lanka hung in the balance. She knew that the coming months would be decisive. and she was prepared to do whatever it took to ensure that her legacy and that of her husband would endure. The battles on the battlefield were important, but the battles within the court would prove to be just as critical in determining the fate of the kingdom. As the political tensions within the royal court continued to rise, Anula's position as the true power behind the throne became increasingly evident. Devanampiya Tissa, despite his strength as a ruler, was more and more reliant on his wife's wisdom and guidance. The success of the military campaign in the south had secured the kingdom's borders for the time being, but Anula knew that there were still many challenges to overcome. External threats from the Tamil kings were never fully eradicated, and the internal political landscape remained fraught with intrigue and deception. Within the palace, the nobles who had once been her allies now began to show signs of resentment. Anula's growing power was becoming a source of envy, and whispers of dissent were spreading through the corridors of the court. Many of the old guard, who had once been loyal to Tissa and served under his leadership, now saw Anula as a threat to their own positions. They were accustomed to a court where their influence was unquestioned, and the idea that a woman, especially one who had not been born into royal blood, held such sway was unacceptable to them. In the face of this opposition, Anula remained steadfast. She knew that she could not allow these factions to weaken the kingdom from within. She had spent years carefully building her network of allies, but now it was time to take a more direct approach. The time had come for Anula to consolidate her power in the court, to make it clear to the nobles that their ambitions could not rival hers. The first move in her strategy came in the form of an ambitious political maneuver. Anula called for a grand council, inviting all of the key nobles and military leaders to attend. This was a bold move, as it was unusual for the queen to take such an active role in the administration of state affairs. But Anula was not merely acting as a queen. She was positioning herself as the true leader of the kingdom. As the council convened, Anula addressed the gathered nobles and military commanders, reminding them of the successes of the past years. She spoke of the victories over the Tamil forces, the securing of the southern borders, and the growing influence of Sri Lanka under Tissa's reign. But beneath the surface of her words there was a clear message. She was the one who had guided the kingdom to this point, and she would continue to steer it toward future success. Anula's speech was well received by many of the nobles, but there were some who were not so easily swayed. One of the most prominent among them was a powerful noble named Kasyapa, a man known for his military prowess and his influence within the court. Kasyapa had been a close advisor to Tissa for many years, but his ambitions were well known. He saw Anula's growing power as a direct threat to his own influence, and he was determined to challenge her. At the council, Kasyapa openly criticized Anula's role in the kingdom's affairs, arguing that the queen had overstepped her bounds and that Tissa, as king, should be the one making the final decisions. The confrontation between Anula and Kasyapa was tense. The other nobles watched as the two powerful figures locked eyes, each knowing that the outcome of this encounter could determine the future of the kingdom. But Anula, ever the strategist, did not rise to the bait. Instead, she calmly countered Kasyapa's arguments, pointing to the successes of the past years and emphasizing that Tissa's rule was strong precisely because of the support he had from her. She made it clear that she was not trying to undermine Tissa's authority, but rather to strengthen it by ensuring that the kingdom's decisions were made with the best interests of all its people in mind. The argument between Anula and Kasyapa did not end with a clear victor, but it was clear that Anula had gained a significant amount of support from the council. The nobles who had previously been wary of her influence now saw her as a capable and effective leader, one who was willing to stand up for what was best for the kingdom. The challenge posed by Kasyapa had only served to highlight Anula's strength, and in the end, it was her unwavering resolve that had won the day. But while Anula had emerged victorious in this particular battle, the war was far from over. The political factions within the court were still shifting, and there were those who continued to plot against her. The nobles who had once supported Kasyapa now saw the writing on the wall. They knew that Anula was not someone to be underestimated, and they began to seek new alliances in an attempt to undermine her influence. One of the most significant threats came from a faction led by a powerful military commander named Mahendra. Mahendra had been a loyal supporter of Tissa, but he was also fiercely independent and had a reputation for being willing to challenge authority when he saw fit. He had served in many of the kingdom's military campaigns and had earned the respect of the soldiers. However, Mahendra had grown disillusioned with the growing influence of the queen. He believed that the military should have more control over the kingdom's affairs, and that Tissa's reliance on Anula had weakened the monarchy. Mahendra began to gather support from other military commanders, promising them greater power and influence in exchange for their loyalty. As his faction grew in strength, Anula knew that she had to act quickly to neutralize this threat before it escalated into an outright rebellion. She carefully orchestrated a series of diplomatic moves, reaching out to key allies within the military and offering them positions of influence in exchange for their support. She also began to appeal to the soldiers themselves, reminding them of the victories they had achieved under Tissa's leadership and emphasizing the importance of unity in the face of external threats. The conflict between Anula and Mahendra came to a head when Mahendra attempted to stage a coup against the queen. He gathered his forces and marched toward the capital, hoping to seize control of the throne and remove Anula from power. But Anula, ever the strategist, was prepared. She had anticipated Mahendra's move and had already positioned her loyal forces in key locations throughout the capital. When Mahendra's forces arrived, they were met with fierce resistance. The military commander was forced to retreat, and his rebellion was crushed before it could gain any real momentum. Anula's victory over Mahendra solidified her position as the undisputed leader of the kingdom. The military, once divided, was now firmly under her control. She had proven once again that her political instincts and her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of court intrigue were unmatched. But as the dust settled from the rebellion, Anula knew that the kingdom's future remained uncertain. The political factions that had once plotted against her had been defeated, but there were always new threats on the horizon. She understood that she could not afford to rest on her laurels. The kingdom's survival depended on her ability to maintain her grip on power and continue to guide Tissa toward a future of peace and prosperity. With the rebellion quelled and the military firmly under her control, Anula turned her attention to the future. She knew that the kingdom's survival depended not only on military strength but on the stability of the royal court. To ensure that her influence would endure, she began to make strategic moves to secure her legacy. She sought out the most influential nobles in the kingdom and began to form alliances with them, solidifying her support within the court. She also continued to work closely with Tissa, ensuring that their bond remained strong and that the kingdom's decisions were made in tandem with Anula's wisdom guiding the way. As the political landscape of Sri Lanka continued to evolve, Anula's power grew. She had faced numerous challenges and had emerged victorious in each of them. But she knew that the future was always uncertain. The kingdom was at a crossroads, and the decisions made in the coming years would determine the fate of Sri Lanka for generations to come. Anula, with her unwavering resolve and unmatched political skill, was prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, confident that she would continue to shape the kingdom's destiny. As Anula's political influence in the court continued to solidify, she turned her attention to matters beyond the immediate challenges of military campaigns and internal dissent. She recognized that her reign, while unchallenged for now, was not guaranteed to endure without significant long-term planning. The kingdom's future rested on more than just military victories and political maneuvering. It depended on a vision for the future, one that could ensure stability, prosperity, and the preservation of Tissa's legacy. Anula's first step in this longer-term strategy was to focus on the education and upbringing of the royal heirs. While she had successfully navigated the turbulent political waters of the court, Anula knew that the true test of her legacy would lie in the generations that followed. Ensuring that Tissa's successors were prepared to rule with wisdom, strength, and diplomacy would be key to the survival of the kingdom. As such, Anula took it upon herself to personally oversee the education of their children, ensuring that they were taught not only the traditional martial skills of rulers but also the art of governance, diplomacy, and moral leadership. Under Anula's guidance, the royal children were exposed to the teachings of the Buddhist monks, learning not just the religious principles of Buddhism but also the social and political philosophies that had allowed Buddhism to flourish across Sri Lanka. Anula herself was well-versed in these teachings and believed that Buddhism, with its emphasis on peace, balance, and the welfare of the people, could be the foundation upon which the kingdom would be built for centuries to come. She ensured that the next generation of rulers understood the importance of religious harmony, moral integrity, and the need for a ruler to be both a political leader and a spiritual guide to their people. Beyond the royal family, Anula recognized that the broader court needed to be brought into alignment with her vision for the future. To this end, she began to implement reforms aimed at consolidating the power of the monarchy while ensuring that the nobility remained loyal. She began to distribute more power to her most trusted allies within the military and the clergy, creating a network of loyalists who would act as her eyes and ears in every corner of the kingdom. By carefully balancing the interests of the nobility with those of the military and religious leaders, Anula ensured that no single faction could rise to threaten her authority. Her reforms were met with resistance from some corners of the court, particularly from the older nobles who had grown accustomed to wielding power independently. These nobles were not pleased by Anula's growing influence and her efforts to centralize authority in the hands of the monarchy. They feared that the changes she was implementing would strip them of their power and reduce their influence in the royal court. Despite their opposition, Anula remained steadfast in her determination to preserve the unity of the kingdom and protect her family's future. One of the most significant challenges to her reforms came from a group of nobles who had once been loyal to the king but had begun to question his leadership due to his reliance on Anula. Led by a man named Jayasena, these nobles openly criticized Anula's role in the court, accusing her of undermining the traditional balance of power and weakening the monarchy by concentrating authority in the hands of a few. Jayasena, a shrewd and ambitious noble, had long harbored aspirations of power and saw Anula as the greatest obstacle to his ambitions. The faction led by Jayasena began to gather support from other nobles, and whispers of rebellion began to circulate. Anula, ever vigilant, was quick to recognize the danger this faction posed to her carefully constructed network of allies. Rather than immediately confronting them with force, Anula took a more strategic approach. She knew that Jayasena and his supporters were not mere rebels. They were well-connected and influential within the court. The key to neutralizing this threat was to isolate Jayasena politically and remove him from the center of power. Anula began by subtly undermining Jayasena's influence among the nobility. She quietly cultivated relationships with key nobles who had been drawn into his faction, offering them more favorable positions within the court and the military in exchange for their loyalty. As these nobles began to shift their allegiance, Jayasena found himself increasingly isolated. The nobles who had once supported him began to question his leadership and his ability to provide them with the power they desired. With each passing day, Jayasena's faction weakened, and Anula's power grew stronger. But Anula knew that to completely eliminate the threat posed by Jayasena, she would need to act decisively. She ordered a Grand Council meeting to be convened, where she would confront Jayasena publicly. The council, which included the highest-ranking military commanders, religious leaders, and nobles in the kingdom, was the perfect platform for Anula to assert her dominance once and for all. She presented evidence of Jayasena's attempts to undermine the monarchy, accusing him of conspiring to weaken the king's rule and destabilize the kingdom. Jayasena, caught off guard by the sudden turn of events, attempted to defend himself, but his arguments were weak, and his support among the nobles had dwindled. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the council, recognizing the threat he posed to the kingdom's stability, voted to have him removed from his position of power. Jayasena was stripped of his titles, and his supporters were dismissed from their positions within the court. The rebellion was over before it could truly begin, and Anula's position at the heart of the kingdom was unchallenged once again. While this victory over Jayasena solidified Anula's control over the court, it also served as a reminder of the fragile nature of power. Even in times of peace, internal threats could arise at any moment. Anula's ability to neutralize these threats, both subtly and decisively, ensured that her authority remained unchallenged. But she also knew that the future would bring new challenges, both external and internal, that would test her leadership once again. In the wake of Jayasena's downfall, Anula turned her attention to the growing tensions along the kingdom's borders. The peace with the Tamil kingdoms had held for several years, but Anula could sense that the situation was beginning to shift. The Tamil kings, although temporarily appeased by the treaty she had brokered, were now strengthening their military forces. Rumors of a possible alliance between the Tamil kingdoms began to surface, and Anula knew that the time for action was approaching. As Sri Lanka's southern border remained a flashpoint for conflict, Anula began to prepare for the worst. She knew that the kingdom's survival depended on maintaining a strong, unified front both within the court and on the battlefield. To this end, she began to take a more active role in military strategy, working closely with the commanders who had supported her in the past. Anula had long been a master of political maneuvering, but now she would show that she was just as capable in the art of warfare. The fate of the kingdom and of Anula's legacy now rested on her ability to navigate the complex interplay of military strategy, diplomacy, and internal politics. She understood that the challenges ahead would require every ounce of her cunning, strength, and resolve. As she prepared for the battles to come, Anula knew that she would once again be tested by her enemies, by her allies, and by the very forces of history itself. With Jayasina's downfall, Anula had secured another victory, but the political landscape of Sri Lanka remained as volatile as ever. Though she had quelled internal dissent and neutralized the most immediate threats to her rule, the looming shadow of external conflict still hung over the kingdom. The peace with the Tamil kingdoms had, for the time being, stabilized the southern border, but Anula knew that this peace was fragile. The Tamil kings, though temporarily appeased by her diplomatic efforts, were still a potential threat, and she could sense that they were quietly building their forces, preparing for a future clash. The situation was further complicated by the growing internal tensions in the court. While Anula had successfully neutralized the noble factions that had opposed her, there were still those who saw her as a foreign influence in the royal court, someone who had risen to power through her marriage to Tissa rather than through traditional royal bloodlines. These factions, though subdued for the moment, would not stay silent forever. Anula understood that her continued success depended not just on military victories but on her ability to manage the shifting allegiances within the palace walls. It was during this period of relative peace, as the external threat from the Tamil kingdoms simmered and internal factionalism continued to threaten her rule, that Anula decided to solidify her legacy in a way that would transcend the short-term battles for power. She knew that in order for Sri Lanka to thrive in the long run, the kingdom needed a stable and lasting foundation, one that could withstand not only the pressures of war but also the changing tides of politics. Anula began to focus on securing the future of the kingdom through the establishment of institutions that would endure beyond her reign. The first of these initiatives was the expansion of the Buddhist monastic system. Anula understood that Buddhism had become the cornerstone of Sri Lanka's cultural and political identity, and she believed that by strengthening the Buddhist monasteries, she could ensure that the kingdom would remain united under the teachings of the Buddha long after she was gone. To this end, Anula ordered the construction of several new monasteries and temples, many of them strategically placed along the kingdom's borders to strengthen the spiritual unity of the people and to further embed Buddhism into the fabric of the kingdom's governance. She also worked to integrate the monastic community into the kingdom's decision-making process, ensuring that the Buddhist clergy would continue to have a voice in the governance of the kingdom. In addition to her efforts to strengthen Buddhism's role in the kingdom, Anula also turned her attention to the kingdom's education system. She realized that in order to secure the future of Sri Lanka, the next generation of rulers, warriors, and scholars needed to be well-trained in the art of governance, military strategy, and diplomacy. She established a series of royal academies where the children of the nobility and military commanders could receive training in statecraft, philosophy, and the martial arts. These academies, which would become the foundation of Sri Lanka's intellectual and military elite, were designed to create a new generation of leaders who would be capable of governing the kingdom in Anula's image. At the same time, Anula recognized that the kingdom's military strength was vital to its continued survival. She worked closely with the military commanders, ensuring that the kingdom's forces remained well-equipped and ready for any potential conflict. She also made significant efforts to integrate the military and civilian sectors of the kingdom, ensuring that the army was not just a tool of war but a protector of the people. This approach, which focused on the welfare of the people as well as the strength of the military, was a hallmark of Anula's leadership. But despite these efforts to secure the kingdom's future, the external threat from the Tamil kingdoms continued to grow. The peace that Anula had so carefully crafted was beginning to fray at the edges, and the Tamil rulers, seeing the strength of Sri Lanka's military and political unity, began to make preparations for a renewed invasion. They were emboldened by the growing tensions within the royal court and the seeming instability that had begun to creep into the kingdom. Anula, ever vigilant, sensed that a new war was on the horizon. The growing unrest in the court and the external threats from the Tamil kingdoms were beginning to converge, and the time for action was fast approaching. She called upon her most trusted military commanders and advisors, convening a series of secret meetings to discuss their strategy in the event of an invasion. Anula knew that this war would be different from the battles of the past. The Tamil kingdoms, though not as numerous as Sri Lanka's forces, were highly skilled in warfare, and they were prepared to wage a long and brutal conflict. Anula's strategy was simple yet bold. She would strike first, taking the battle to the enemy before they had a chance to organize and launch a full-scale invasion. This strategy of preemptive action was risky, but Anula believed that it was the only way to ensure that the kingdom's borders remained secure. The military campaign that followed was one of the most difficult and costly in Sri Lanka's history. The Tamil forces, though initially caught off guard by Anula's preemptive strike, quickly regrouped and mounted a fierce resistance. The battles were bloody and relentless, and the kingdom's soldiers faced numerous setbacks along the way. Anula, however, remained steadfast. She personally oversaw the military strategy, ensuring that her forces were well coordinated and strategically positioned. She also worked to maintain the morale of the soldiers, visiting the front lines regularly to offer words of encouragement and to remind them of the stakes of the war. The war raged on for months, and despite the kingdom's military prowess, the Tamil forces continued to press their advantage. Anula knew that the outcome of the war would not only determine the fate of the kingdom but also the future of her reign. She could not afford to lose this war, for it would mean the end of her carefully crafted legacy and the collapse of everything she had worked so hard to build. As the war continued, Anula's military strategy began to show results. The Tamil forces, though fierce, were unable to break through Sri Lanka's defenses. The tide began to turn in favor of the kingdom, and slowly but surely Anula's forces pushed the Tamil armies back. The final victory came when Anula's forces decisively defeated the Tamil commanders in a climactic battle near the southern borders, securing the kingdom's borders for the foreseeable future. The victory, though hard-won, was a testament to Anula's strength and strategic brilliance. The Tamil threat had been neutralized, and Sri Lanka stood victorious. But Anula, ever mindful of the fragility of peace, knew that the work was far from over. The war had cost the kingdom dearly, and the political landscape would need to be rebuilt in the aftermath of the conflict. With the Tamil forces decisively defeated and the southern borders of Sri Lanka secured, Anula stood at the pinnacle of her power. The kingdom, though scarred by the costs of war, was now united and stronger than ever. The victory had not only silenced her critics but had also cemented her position as the true architect of Sri Lanka's prosperity. Yet, Anula knew that her work was far from over. The victory had come at a heavy price, and the kingdom needed to heal not just militarily but politically, socially, and spiritually. The first task that Anula set for herself was the reconstruction of the royal court. While the military victory had garnered her the loyalty of the armed forces, the long-term stability of the kingdom would depend on the political alliances she could foster within the court. The nobles who had once opposed her were now cautiously supportive, but Anula knew that their loyalty was fickle. As time had shown, the nobles in the royal court could shift allegiances with the tide of fortune, and she could not afford to let her guard down. Anula's strategy for court consolidation was twofold. She needed to both neutralize her enemies and solidify the alliances that had served her well in the past. To achieve this, she began by strategically placing her supporters in positions of power, ensuring that key posts within the military, religious institutions, and royal bureaucracy were filled by her most trusted allies. She also began to extend the hand of reconciliation to those nobles who had opposed her in the past, offering them land, titles, and positions of influence in exchange for their loyalty. One of the most significant moves she made during this period was to reassert the monarchy's control over the Buddhist monastic community. While the monks had been instrumental in maintaining the kingdom's unity and providing spiritual guidance to the people, Anula understood that their influence could also be a source of potential discord. The monks, though generally loyal to the crown, had their own political ambitions, and Anula knew that in order to ensure long-term stability, the monarchy had to maintain a firm grip on the religious institutions. She personally oversaw the construction of new temples and monasteries throughout Sri Lanka, reinforcing the idea that Buddhism and the monarchy were intertwined. Anula's patronage of Buddhism was not just a religious gesture, it was a strategic move to ensure that the clergy remained loyal to the throne. She also established a network of royal chaplains who would serve as liaisons between the monarchy and the monastic community, ensuring that the religious establishment would not act as an independent political force within the kingdom. While Anula worked to secure her position within the royal court, she was also acutely aware of the kingdom's external vulnerabilities. The threat from the Tamil kingdoms was not entirely eradicated, and she knew that, given time, they would attempt to regain control of the southern territories. To that end, she reinforced the kingdom's military infrastructure, ensuring that the soldiers were well-trained and that the kingdom's defenses were fortified. Anula's leadership also extended to the economic realm. She understood that a strong economy was essential to the kingdom's survival, and she worked tirelessly to rebuild the country's infrastructure. The devastation caused by the war had left many regions in ruin, and it was essential to restore trade routes, rebuild the agricultural sector, and ensure that the kingdom's resources were being utilized efficiently. One of Anula's greatest achievements in this regard was the establishment of a royal trade network that connected Sri Lanka to other kingdoms in South Asia. She negotiated trade agreements with kingdoms in India, Southeast Asia, and beyond, ensuring that Sri Lanka would be a central hub of commerce and trade. This economic strategy not only enriched the kingdom but also helped to strengthen its political alliances with neighboring states. Despite the progress made under Anula's rule, there were still threats lurking within the kingdom. Some of the nobles, particularly those who had been sidelined by her rise to power, were becoming increasingly restless. They began to conspire against her, seeking to weaken her influence within the court. Among them was a nobleman named Surya who had long been resentful of Anula's power. He had been one of the key players in the failed rebellion led by Jayasena, and he now saw an opportunity to challenge Anula's authority once again. Surya, who had significant support within the royal military, began to gather allies among the nobility. He knew that Anula's rule depended on the loyalty of the military and the support of the common people. He sought to exploit any weaknesses in the kingdom's military infrastructure, hoping to spark a rebellion that would overthrow the queen. Anula, however, was not easily caught off guard. She had spent years cultivating a network of loyal supporters, and she was aware of the growing discontent among the nobles. Her spies reported back to her, informing her of Surya's movements and his attempts to rally support for his cause. Anula acted quickly, calling for a royal council to be convened where she would confront Surya directly. At the council, Anula accused Surya of treason, presenting evidence of his attempts to undermine the monarchy and sow discord among the military leaders. The confrontation was tense, but Anula's command of the situation was unwavering. She called upon her loyal allies in the military to pledge their support, and within hours, Surya's faction was dismantled. Surya was imprisoned, and his supporters were either executed or exiled from the court. This victory over Surya was yet another demonstration of Anula's political acumen. She had once again proven that her power was unshakable, and that her ability to navigate the shifting tides of court politics was unmatched. But as she looked around at the aftermath of the confrontation, she knew that this was not the end of the challenges she would face. In the years that followed, Anula continued to secure her reign, ensuring that the kingdom remained stable and prosperous. Her influence extended beyond the royal court and the military. She became a beloved figure among the common people, who saw her as the protector of their welfare. Anula's reign was marked by a period of relative peace, and the kingdom flourished under her leadership. As the years passed, Anula's health began to decline. The toll of years spent at the forefront of political and military affairs had worn her down, and she knew that the time for her to step back was drawing near. Her thoughts turned to the future of Sri Lanka, and she began to focus on ensuring that her legacy would be carried on by the next generation. Anula's influence over Tissa's successors was crucial. She worked closely with her children, ensuring that they were well prepared to rule the kingdom in the years to come. She also took steps to secure the succession, ensuring that the transition of power would be smooth and that the kingdom would not fall into disarray after her death. The end of Anula's reign was not marked by any grand farewell, but rather by the quiet, steady hand of a ruler who had spent her life building a kingdom that would endure for generations. As she passed from this world, she left behind a legacy that would shape Sri Lanka for centuries to come. As Anula's reign continued to solidify, the kingdom of Anuradhapura thrived under her leadership. The military was strong, the economy was flourishing, and the religious unity between the crown and the Buddhist clergy provided a spiritual backbone to the rule of the monarchy. However, as her influence reached its zenith, Anula became increasingly aware of the delicate balance she had to maintain within her court, where old rivalries and new tensions constantly simmered beneath the surface. With the passing of time, it became clear that Sri Lanka's stability rested not only on Anula's strength but also on the capacity of her successors to carry the weight of her legacy. She had done everything in her power to ensure that Tissa's heirs were prepared for leadership. But the true test of the kingdom's future would lie in the smoothness of the transition when her time to step down inevitably arrived. As her health began to fail, she could feel the weight of her years catching up with her. Yet, she was not one to surrender control without ensuring that the kingdom's legacy was secure. One of Anula's most pressing concerns in the final years of her reign was the matter of succession. Tissa, though still alive, was aging, and Anula had been the de facto ruler for years, leading the kingdom with a firm hand. The time had come for her to solidify her heirs' place in the royal hierarchy. She had raised their children with the best education, training them in the arts of governance and diplomacy, but Anula knew that true power was not simply inherited, it was earned and demonstrated. In these years of political consolidation, Anula began to observe the dynamics between her children. She had two sons, both of whom had been groomed for leadership. The eldest, Prince Mahinda, was strong-willed, intelligent, and charismatic, but he lacked the delicate political sensibilities that Anula had cultivated in her own leadership. The younger son, Prince Vijayabahu, was more reserved, thoughtful, and patient, yet his quiet nature sometimes led others to underestimate his potential. Anula recognized the importance of choosing the right successor, one who would balance military strength with political acumen. For years, Anula had carefully played the role of mediator between her sons, ensuring that neither of them felt marginalized or threatened by the other. Yet as her health deteriorated, she knew that her time to guide them was running out. She began to subtly steer them toward one another, encouraging cooperation over rivalry and laying the groundwork for a future where they could rule together if necessary. She believed that the strength of Sri Lanka's monarchy lay not in the power of one individual but in the united leadership of both brothers, each bringing their unique talents to the throne. As Anula's health worsened, she became more reflective about the legacy she was leaving behind. In her mind, the kingdom was the product of her vision, her perseverance, and her strategic intelligence. Yet she understood that power could never be fully controlled, and that every ruler was at the mercy of both the decisions they made and the forces that lay beyond their grasp. She also knew that the history of Sri Lanka would judge her not by the battles she won or the alliances she forged, but by how well the kingdom weathered the challenges that lay ahead after her death. But even in the final years of her reign, Anula's influence remained steadfast. Her decision to increase the royal court's collaboration with the monastic community, coupled with the establishment of a well-trained military, meant that Sri Lanka would not fall into disarray upon her passing. Her patronage of the Buddhist clergy had ensured that they, too, would act as stabilizing forces in the kingdom. The monks who had come to see Anula as a defender of their faith would work to maintain the unity that she had fostered, ensuring that the kingdom would remain under Buddhist rule and that any successor, whether it be her sons or another leader, would understand the importance of maintaining the harmony between the monarchy and the Buddhist clergy. However, as Anula turned her attention inward, to her family and the passing of her legacy, the world outside her palace walls continued to shift. The Tamil kings, who had been forced into temporary retreat following the wars with Sri Lanka, began to regroup, their armies rebuilding and their diplomatic channels realigning. Anula had always known that the peace she had brokered was fragile, and her health's decline created a window of opportunity for the Tamil kings to test the limits of her kingdom's defenses once again. News came to Anula that the southern borders, where the Tamil armies had been scattered years ago, were now becoming restive. Rebel factions within the Tamil territories were stirring, and the once dominant Tamil kingdoms were seeking to reclaim lost territories. This posed a direct threat to the southern frontiers of Sri Lanka and was a test that would challenge Anula's legacy. With her condition worsening, Anula's ability to manage the military and political affairs of the kingdom from the front lines was severely limited. But she would not go down quietly. She immediately called upon Prince Mahinda to step into the role of commander-in-chief, preparing him for the difficult task of leading Sri Lanka's military against the growing external threats. Anula's confidence in Mahinda was high. She knew that he was capable, if somewhat brash. As for Prince Vijayabahu, she asked him to continue his diplomatic work, cultivating alliances with neighboring kingdoms and ensuring that Sri Lanka remained united on the political front. The military campaign that followed would prove to be one of the most difficult and defining challenges of Anula's reign. Prince Mahinda, with his fierce military acumen, took charge of the southern borders, where the Tamil forces had begun to amass. The prince commanded his armies with determination, pushing back against the rebel factions with both military force and strategic intelligence. Anula, though unable to directly command the battlefield, continued to offer advice to her son, reminding him of the lessons she had taught him over the years, to fight not only with strength but with diplomacy, to consider the political consequences of every move, and to keep the kingdom's long-term interests at heart. As the military campaign raged on, Anula's health continued to decline. She spent more time in the royal chambers, surrounded by her closest advisors and her sons, but her mind remained sharp and her resolve unshaken. In the midst of the turmoil, she sought to ensure that her legacy would live on, not just in the kingdom's borders but in the hearts and minds of the people. She made provisions for her sons, ensuring that the crown would be passed down smoothly and that Sri Lanka's political landscape would remain stable after her death. She reminded her sons that their success as rulers would depend not on the battles they won but on the ability to maintain unity among the people and the royal court. The day eventually came when Anula's reign came to an end. Surrounded by her loved ones, she passed away quietly in her chambers. Her death marked the end of an era, and Sri Lanka mourned the loss of one of its greatest rulers. But Anula's legacy was far from over. As the people of Sri Lanka reflected on her reign, they understood that it was not just her military victories or political strategies that had defined her, but her unwavering commitment to the stability and prosperity of her kingdom. In the years that followed, Prince Mahinda and Prince Vijayabahu would ascend to the throne, ruling together as Anula had envisioned. The kingdom would continue to thrive, and Anula's memory would live on in the temples, the academies, and the hearts of the people. Sri Lanka's strength, its unity, and its success would forever be tied to the decisions she had made during her lifetime. With the passing of Queen Anula, the kingdom of Sri Lanka found itself at a crossroads. Her death marked the end of an era of political brilliance, military triumphs, and unwavering leadership. Anula had been the backbone of the kingdom for decades, guiding both her husband, Devanampiya Tissa, and the nation through turbulent times. Her influence had shaped the very foundation of the kingdom's power. Now, as the people mourned her passing, the weight of her legacy fell upon the shoulders of her sons, Prince Mahinda and Prince Vijayabahu. The transition of power, though anticipated, was not without its challenges. Anula's death created a vacuum of leadership, and the royal court, once unified under her rule, now became a battleground for power. Prince Mahinda, the elder son, was the obvious choice to succeed her as the next ruler of Sri Lanka. He had been trained in the arts of military strategy and governance, and his military successes had earned him the respect of the kingdom's soldiers. However, Prince Vijayabahu, though quieter and more reserved, was also a capable leader in his own right. Anula had envisioned a joint leadership, but the dynamics of the royal family and the court made this vision difficult to realize. Prince Mahinda, eager to prove his worth as the rightful heir, took control of the military and began to prepare for any potential external threats. The Tamil kingdoms, though weakened in the past, still posed a threat, and Mahinda's focus was on securing the southern borders. He ordered the strengthening of fortifications, the recruitment of new soldiers, and the expansion of Sri Lanka's naval capabilities to ensure that the kingdom would be prepared for any attack. The military campaign that had once been Anula's domain now fell squarely into Mahinda's hands. While Mahinda focused on the kingdom's military needs, Prince Vijayabahu, who had long been involved in diplomacy and governance, took charge of internal affairs. He sought to preserve the unity of the royal court and ensure that the kingdom's political alliances remained strong. Vijayabahu's leadership style was more conciliatory than his brother's, and he worked hard to maintain peace and stability within the court, reaching out to key nobles and ensuring that their support was secured. His efforts to maintain balance within the kingdom's political structure helped to stabilize the court after the tumultuous period following Anula's death. Yet, the tensions between the brothers remained. Mahinda's more aggressive approach to ruling, with his focus on military power, contrasted sharply with Vijayabahu's diplomatic efforts. While Mahinda sought to assert his dominance through strength, Vijayabahu believed that lasting peace could only be achieved through cooperation and dialogue. The two brothers, though united in their desire to rule, had differing visions of what Sri Lanka's future should look like. Despite these differences, the kingdom of Sri Lanka remained strong. The influence of Buddhism, which Anula had so carefully nurtured, continued to guide the kingdom's moral compass. The Buddhist clergy, who had been staunch supporters of Anula, rallied behind her sons, offering their guidance and spiritual support. Anula's patronage of Buddhism had left an indelible mark on the kingdom, and the monks continued to wield considerable influence in both the spiritual and political spheres. However, Anula's death also brought to the surface the political factions that had once been silenced under her rule. The nobles, who had long feared her power, now saw an opportunity to gain greater influence. Factions within the court began to shift, with some nobles seeking to align themselves with Mahinda's military leadership, while others sided with Vijayabahu's more diplomatic approach. As the royal brothers navigated the complex political landscape, they found themselves increasingly at odds with some of the nobility, who were eager to exploit the power vacuum left by Anula's passing. In the midst of this growing tension, a new threat emerged from the neighboring Tamil kingdoms. Despite the peace that had been brokered by Anula, the Tamil kings had not forgotten their desire to reclaim the southern territories of Sri Lanka. The kingdoms to the south had long coveted the rich lands of Sri Lanka's coastal regions, and they began to prepare for war. Word of this new threat reached the royal court, and both Mahinda and Vijayabahu knew that the time had come to defend their kingdom once again. The situation was complicated by the presence of rival factions within the royal court. Some nobles, sensing an opportunity to further their own interests, began to challenge the leadership of both brothers. The court became divided, with some supporting Mahinda's military approach, while others rallied behind Vijayabahu's vision of diplomacy and negotiation. In the midst of this political turmoil, the kingdom's enemies grew bolder. The Tamil forces, eager to take advantage of Sri Lanka's internal divisions, began to amass their armies along the southern borders. It was clear that a decision needed to be made. The kingdom could not afford to be torn apart by internal strife while facing an external threat. Prince Mahinda, determined to prove his worth as the kingdom's protector, called for a military campaign to secure the southern borders once and for all. He argued that the kingdom's survival depended on a show of strength and unity, and that the only way to ensure lasting peace was through military victory. Vijayabahu, though concerned about the potential costs of war, understood that the kingdom's future depended on their ability to defend their land. Reluctantly, he agreed to support his brother's plan, though he continued to push for diplomatic negotiations with the Tamil kings as a backup option. The campaign that followed was one of the most intense and costly in Sri Lanka's history. The Tamil forces, though formidable, were no match for the combined strength of the kingdom's army. Mahinda's leadership on the battlefield proved decisive, and after months of skirmishes and military maneuvers, the Tamil forces were forced to retreat. The southern borders were secured, and Sri Lanka emerged victorious once again. But the victory came at a great cost. The war had depleted the kingdom's resources, and the toll on the soldiers was heavy. The political factions within the court, though temporarily silenced by the victory, continued to stir beneath the surface. The tension between Mahinda and Vijayabahu, though temporarily set aside, remained unresolved. Both brothers had proven themselves capable rulers in their own right, but the question of who would ultimately inherit the throne remained unanswered. In the years that followed, the brothers continued to rule together, though their relationship remained strained. The kingdom, though victorious in battle, faced new challenges as the nobles continued to jockey for power. The years of Anula's leadership had set the foundation for a stable kingdom, but the challenges of succession and the shifting dynamics of the royal court were far from over. The passing of Queen Anula had left a profound void in the kingdom of Sri Lanka, and the kingdom's future now rested in the hands of her sons, Prince Mahinda and Prince Vijayabahu. While both were capable leaders in their own right, Anula's absence was keenly felt. The monarchy, which had flourished under her guidance, now faced a time of transition, an uncertain period where the balance of power within the royal court was shifting, and the echoes of Anula's authority continued to reverberate through the halls of the palace. As the kingdom mourned the loss of the queen who had shaped its destiny, the brothers took up the mantle of leadership, each bringing their own style and vision for the future of Sri Lanka. However, despite their shared bloodline, the differences between Mahinda and Vijayabahu were more apparent than ever. Mahinda, the elder of the two, was a warrior by nature. His strength and military prowess had earned him the respect of the soldiers, and he was determined to continue his mother's legacy of protecting Sri Lanka's borders from external threats. Vijayabahu, on the other hand, was more inclined toward diplomacy and governance. His approach was more measured and cautious, preferring negotiation over conflict, and focusing on the internal stability of the kingdom. The question of succession was one that lingered in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. The kingdom had always been ruled by a single monarch, but the challenges presented by their differing leadership styles made the idea of a joint rule more complicated. The court, which had once been united under Anula's strong hand, was now divided. Some nobles supported Mahinda, seeing in him the strength needed to protect the kingdom from foreign threats, while others backed Vijayabahu, who was seen as the more thoughtful and diplomatic of the two. Despite these internal divisions, the kingdom remained stable in the aftermath of Anula's death. The military was strong, and the economic reforms Anula had implemented continued to bear fruit. Sri Lanka was at peace, but it was a fragile peace, one that could easily be undone if the leadership faltered. The growing tensions within the royal court, combined with the continued threat from the Tamil kingdoms to the south, meant that the brothers would have to work together to ensure the kingdom's future. Prince Mahinda, determined to honor his mother's legacy, took a more active role in military affairs. He focused on fortifying the southern borders, where the Tamil kingdoms, though temporarily subdued, had begun to regroup and rebuild their forces. Mahinda ordered the construction of new fortifications along the southern coast and the recruitment of additional soldiers to bolster the kingdom's defenses. He also initiated a series of military drills, ensuring that the kingdom's army remained in top condition and prepared for any potential conflict. Meanwhile, Prince Vijayabahu focused on the kingdom's internal affairs. He worked tirelessly to maintain peace within the court, navigating the political rivalries that had begun to emerge in the wake of Anula's death. He sought to maintain the support of the nobility, working to strengthen the alliances his mother had forged during her reign. He also focused on continuing the educational reforms Anula had started, ensuring that the next generation of rulers would be well prepared to lead Sri Lanka into the future. The brothers, though divided in their approaches to governance, knew that they had to unite in order to preserve the kingdom. The external threats from the Tamil kingdoms were real, and the nobles within the court could not be trusted to maintain their loyalty if the kingdom was divided. As the years passed, Mahinda and Vijayabahu began to cooperate more closely, recognizing that their combined efforts were needed to secure the future of Sri Lanka. Mahinda, with his military experience, began to involve Vijayabahu in the planning of military campaigns, while Vijayabahu worked to secure diplomatic support from neighboring kingdoms. Their efforts bore fruit when a new external threat emerged. The Tamil kingdoms, having regained some strength after years of rebuilding, began to test Sri Lanka's defenses once again. The first signs of aggression came in the form of raids along the southern coast. Though the raids were small in scale, they were a clear indication that the Tamil rulers were preparing for something larger. Mahinda, who had long anticipated such an attack, immediately called for the mobilization of the kingdom's army. He had already stationed troops along the southern borders, but now he would need to act decisively. The situation required careful planning. Mahinda and Vijayabahu met in secret to discuss their strategy, recognizing that this would be a critical test of their leadership. Mahinda, eager to take the fight to the enemy, proposed a preemptive strike, an aggressive campaign to disrupt the Tamil forces before they could mount a full-scale invasion. Vijayabahu, though more cautious, agreed to support his brother's plan, understanding that the kingdom's survival depended on a unified response to the threat. Together, they devised a strategy that would involve both military action and diplomatic efforts to prevent the situation from escalating into an all-out war. The campaign that followed was one of the most intense and costly in Sri Lanka's history. The Tamil forces, though smaller in number, were well-organized and fought fiercely to defend their territory. The battle was hard-fought, with both sides suffering heavy losses. But despite the challenges, Mahinda's leadership on the battlefield proved decisive. The Sri Lankan forces, bolstered by Vijayabahu's diplomatic efforts to secure alliances with neighboring kingdoms, were able to push back the Tamil armies and force them into retreat. With the Tamil forces once again defeated, Sri Lanka's southern borders were secured and the kingdom emerged victorious. The victory, though hard-won, solidified Mahinda's position as the military leader of Sri Lanka and cemented his place as the rightful heir to the throne. But the victory also had a lasting impact on the kingdom's future. The war had taken a heavy toll on the kingdom's resources, and the scars of the conflict would remain for years to come. Mahinda, now fully in control of the military, turned his attention to rebuilding the kingdom's infrastructure and restoring the economy. He worked closely with Vijayabahu to ensure that the kingdom's political structure remained intact and that the nobles remained loyal to the crown. As the years passed, the brothers ruled together, though the tensions between them remained. Mahinda's military prowess and Vijayabahu's diplomatic skills complemented each other, but their differing leadership styles continued to create challenges. Mahinda's focus on military strength sometimes led to a heavy-handed approach to governance, while Vijayabahu's more cautious nature often led to delays in decision-making. Despite their differences, they both recognized the importance of their shared rule in maintaining the stability of the kingdom. Sri Lanka, under the leadership of Mahinda and Vijayabahu, continued to thrive. But it was clear that the kingdom would never be the same without Anula. Her death had marked the end of an era, and her absence was felt by both her sons and the people of Sri Lanka. Yet, her legacy lived on in the decisions she had made, the alliances she had forged, and the stability she had brought to the kingdom. Her vision for Sri Lanka had endured, and her sons, though different in their approaches, had carried her legacy forward. As the kingdom of Sri Lanka began to stabilize in the aftermath of the Tamil incursions, Prince Mahinda and Prince Vijayabahu faced the monumental task of rebuilding and consolidating their rule. The victory over the Tamil forces had ensured the kingdom's southern borders were safe for the time being, but the costs of war had left scars on the land and the people. The war had drained the kingdom's resources, and the military, though triumphant, was exhausted. Rebuilding would require not just the restoration of the kingdom's infrastructure but the careful management of both military and political power to avoid future conflict and ensure the continued prosperity of Sri Lanka. For Mahinda, the victory had solidified his position as the kingdom's military leader, but the weight of leadership weighed heavily on him. His military campaigns had brought him respect and admiration among the soldiers, but the responsibility of ruling was a different matter altogether. Mahinda was accustomed to the decisive nature of battle, where strategy, strength, and immediate action were paramount. However, ruling a kingdom required diplomacy, patience, and a keen understanding of the delicate balance between power and governance, traits that Mahinda had not yet fully mastered. Vijayabahu, the more diplomatic of the two brothers, understood that the kingdom's survival depended on more than just military might. He knew that a strong ruler had to also be a wise one, able to maintain the loyalty of the nobles and the support of the people. While Mahinda focused on securing the kingdom's borders, Vijayabahu focused on the internal stability of Sri Lanka. He worked tirelessly to mend the rifts within the court, ensuring that the factions that had once risen against Anula's influence were now brought into alignment with the monarchy. Despite their differences, Mahinda and Vijayabahu began to cooperate more closely, realizing that the strength of their combined rule was necessary for the kingdom's continued prosperity. Mahinda, recognizing Vijayabahu's talents as a diplomat, began to rely more on his brother's counsel. Vijayabahu, in turn, understood that the military strength of the kingdom was still crucial, and he worked closely with Mahinda to ensure that the military was properly supported and that the kingdom's defenses remained strong. But even as the brothers worked together to rebuild the kingdom, the political landscape continued to shift. The nobles, who had once been loyal to Anula, were now testing the waters of the new reign. They had witnessed the power dynamics change under Anula's leadership, and many of them were eager to claim their share of influence. The rise of these rival factions threatened the delicate balance that Mahinda and Vijayabahu had worked so hard to achieve. One of the most significant threats came from Raja, a nobleman with long-standing ties to the military and a fierce desire to expand his power. Raja had been a loyal supporter of Anula, and he had fought alongside Mahinda in the previous wars. However, as the political tides began to shift, Raja saw an opportunity to take advantage of the brothers' divided leadership. He began to rally support among the military commanders who felt marginalized by the new distribution of power. His ambition was clear. He sought to position himself as the true power behind the throne, manipulating both Mahinda and Vijayabahu to his advantage. Raja's moves did not go unnoticed. Vijayabahu, ever watchful of the political currents within the court, was the first to spot the danger. He knew that Raja's growing influence within the military could threaten the stability of the kingdom if left unchecked. The kingdom's future could not afford to let another faction rise to challenge the crown, especially one with such strong military ties. Rather than confronting Raja with force, Vijayabahu chose to engage him diplomatically, hoping to neutralize the threat without bloodshed. He invited Raja to a private meeting, where he subtly reminded him of the shared history they had, how, together, they had fought to defend the kingdom and secure its borders. Vijayabahu, with his characteristic patience, assured Raja that there was room for all in the royal court. He promised that the military would continue to have its influence, but that it had to be in service of the crown, not of individual ambition. Raja, though wary of Vijayabahu's words, agreed to a temporary truce. But the tension between the two men was palpable. Raja had not relinquished his desire for power, and Vijayabahu knew that he would need to remain vigilant. For now, the kingdom was at peace, but the factions within the court would continue to simmer, and the brothers' alliance was not yet guaranteed to last. As Vijayabahu dealt with the political challenges, Mahinda remained focused on securing the kingdom's southern borders. The Tamil kings, though temporarily beaten, were far from finished. Mahinda knew that Sri Lanka's military had to remain vigilant, especially in the face of a growing alliance between the Tamil kingdoms. The peaceful years following the last war had allowed both kingdoms to regroup, and Mahinda feared that the next conflict might be even more devastating than the last. To prepare for this, Mahinda began to institute military reforms, ensuring that Sri Lanka's army was both well-trained and well-equipped. He implemented new tactics and strategies learned from the previous war, and ensured that his forces were ready for any confrontation. He also strengthened alliances with neighboring kingdoms, hoping to prevent the Tamil kings from finding any allies who could tip the balance of power. Yet, even with Mahinda's military preparations, Vijayabahu knew that the kingdom's true strength lay in its unity. The challenge that lay ahead was not just one of military might but of political cohesion. The brothers had to ensure that their reign was stable not just on the battlefield but in the court, where the nobility could easily divide the kingdom if they were given the chance. Anula's death had marked the end of an era, but it was now up to Mahinda and Vijayabahu to prove that their rule could carry Sri Lanka into a new age of peace and prosperity. As the years passed, both brothers found themselves at a crossroads. The political tensions within the court continued to rise, and the external threat from the Tamil kingdoms remained ever-present. Mahinda, the military leader, and Vijayabahu, the diplomatic strategist, knew that they had to find a way to balance their contrasting styles of leadership. The kingdom's future would depend on their ability to navigate these challenges, to build unity in the face of division, and to ensure that Anula's legacy would not fade into the past. But as Anula's children, Mahinda and Vijayabahu, worked together to preserve the kingdom, they also faced the inevitable question of succession. Who would inherit the throne when the time came? Would the brothers continue to rule together, or would one rise above the other? The question of succession was not just a political issue. It was a matter of ensuring that the kingdom would survive the inevitable changes of leadership. Anula had long believed that the strength of the kingdom lay in unity, and her children understood that this vision was key to Sri Lanka's future. Whether they ruled together or separately, Mahinda and Vijayabahu knew that the kingdom's survival depended on their ability to navigate the delicate balance between power, diplomacy, and military strength. As the years passed and the brothers continued their rule, the kingdom of Sri Lanka stood strong, yet the political currents within the royal court remained ever-shifting. Prince Mahinda and Prince Vijayabahu, despite their differing leadership styles, had managed to maintain the delicate balance of power that their mother, Queen Anula, had so carefully crafted. But as with all great dynasties, time had a way of testing even the strongest foundations. The question of succession remained ever-present, and the kingdom faced new challenges both from within and from the world outside. In the final years of Mahinda and Vijayabahu's reign, the kingdom's political landscape became increasingly complex. The military had proven its strength under Mahinda's leadership, and the diplomatic efforts spearheaded by Vijayabahu had secured vital alliances with neighboring kingdoms. But as the two brothers grew older, tensions that had been simmering for years began to surface. The age-old question of who would ultimately inherit the throne was now unavoidable. Anula had always hoped for a joint rule between her sons, believing that the strength of both their leadership styles could carry Sri Lanka into the future. Yet, as time wore on, the differences between Mahinda and Vijayabahu grew more pronounced. Mahinda, still focused on military strength, became increasingly frustrated by what he saw as Vijayabahu's cautious and diplomatic approach. He believed that Sri Lanka's survival would depend on its military might, and his focus remained on securing the borders and maintaining a strong army. Vijayabahu, on the other hand, continued to champion diplomacy, understanding that the strength of a kingdom lay not only in its armies but also in its ability to unite its people and maintain peace. The division between the brothers reached its peak when Mahinda, in a moment of frustration, publicly questioned Vijayabahu's approach to foreign diplomacy. He argued that Sri Lanka's alliances, while important, would never replace the need for a powerful military. The court, which had been divided along these lines for years, erupted into open conflict. There were those who supported Mahinda, believing that his military expertise was essential for the kingdom's security. Others, however, sided with Vijayabahu, recognizing the importance of diplomacy and the role it played in preserving the kingdom's long-term peace. It was in the midst of this turmoil that a new crisis emerged, one that threatened to tear apart everything that Anula had worked so hard to build. Word arrived from the southern borders that the Tamil kingdoms, long subdued after their previous defeat, had begun to regroup and rebuild their forces. The growing tensions between the brothers, combined with the external threat from the Tamil kingdoms, created an atmosphere of instability that threatened the very survival of Sri Lanka. Mahinda, ever the military strategist, urged for an immediate response. He believed that the best way to defend the kingdom was to strike preemptively, launching a military campaign to eliminate the Tamil threat before it could become serious. Vijayabahu, cautious as always, argued for a more measured approach. He proposed sending envoys to the Tamil kingdoms to negotiate peace, hoping to avoid the horrors of war that had already cost Sri Lanka so much. But the situation escalated faster than either brother had anticipated. The Tamil kingdoms, emboldened by their recovery, began raiding the southern territories once again. The kingdom's borders were breached, and it became clear that the time for diplomacy had passed. With their differences still unresolved, the two brothers were forced to put aside their personal animosities and lead the kingdom together, united against the common enemy. The military campaign that followed was brutal. Mahinda took command of the army, leading his troops into battle with the same aggression and determination that had marked his previous victories. Vijayabahu, though less enthusiastic about the war, knew that the kingdom's future depended on their success. He provided diplomatic support, sending emissaries to neighboring kingdoms to ensure that they would not take advantage of Sri Lanka's distraction. The campaign stretched on for months, with heavy casualties on both sides. Despite the immense cost of the war, Sri Lanka emerged victorious once again. The Tamil kingdoms, though formidable, were forced to retreat. The southern borders were secured, and the kingdom was once again at peace. But the victory came with a price. The kingdom's resources were depleted, and the once unified royal court was now more divided than ever. Mahinda and Vijayabahu, despite their success on the battlefield, could no longer avoid the underlying issues that had plagued their reign. It became clear that the time had come for the brothers to address the question of succession once and for all. After much deliberation, they agreed that the kingdom would pass to Vijayabahu, the younger of the two, but only on the condition that Mahinda would continue to serve as the kingdom's military leader. Vijayabahu, though not as militarily inclined as his brother, was a skilled diplomat and a wise ruler. and the court saw in him the potential for a more stable and prosperous future. Mahinda, on the other hand, would continue to lead the kingdom's armies, ensuring that Sri Lanka's military strength remained unmatched. The decision to pass the crown to Vijayabahu was not without its challenges. The nobles who had supported Mahinda were initially resistant to the idea, but in time, they came to accept the brothers' decision. Mahinda, though disappointed by the outcome, understood that the future of the kingdom depended on their ability to work together. He pledged his loyalty to Vijayabahu, vowing to protect the kingdom with his military might for as long as he could. As Vijayabahu ascended to the throne, he was mindful of the legacy that his mother, Queen Anula, had left behind. Anula had always believed that the strength of the kingdom lay not in one individual but in the unity of the people, the wisdom of the rulers, and the guidance of the Buddhist clergy. Vijayabahu worked to honor her memory, ensuring that her vision for Sri Lanka's future remained intact. Under Vijayabahu's rule, the kingdom entered a new era of peace and stability. The military was strong, the economy rebounded, and Sri Lanka became a center of learning and culture. The Buddhist monastic system flourished, and the kingdom's diplomatic ties with neighboring kingdoms grew stronger, though the tensions between the brothers had never fully dissipated. They worked together to ensure that Sri Lanka remained united and strong. In the years that followed, Anula's legacy endured. The reforms she had implemented, the alliances she had forged, and the stability she had brought to the kingdom continued to shape Sri Lanka's future. The kingdom's success was not just a testament to the military prowess of Mahinda or the diplomatic skill of Vijayabahu, but to the vision of the woman who had ruled with wisdom, strength, and unyielding resolve. As Vijayabahu grew older, he began to focus on the future of the kingdom once again. He worked to ensure that the next generation of rulers would be as prepared as he had been. The children of the royal family were carefully groomed in the arts of governance, and the legacy of Anula was passed down through the generations. When Vijayabahu passed away, Sri Lanka was left in a stable and prosperous state. His children, raised with the same values of unity, strength, and wisdom that Anula had instilled in him, carried the kingdom forward. Sri Lanka continued to thrive, guided by the lessons of the past and the unbroken legacy of Queen Anula. Her name lived on not only in the temples and monasteries she had helped build but in the hearts of the people who remembered her as the queen who had shaped the future of their kingdom. Anula's legacy was one of resilience, diplomacy, and an unwavering commitment to the prosperity of Sri Lanka. Her reign had been marked by trials and triumphs, but above all, she had left behind a kingdom that stood tall and strong, a kingdom that would endure for centuries to come.